All right. Welcome back, everyone, for the next session today with Dr. Jonathan Conard. He's going to be talking about no-till principles and practices, bridging the gap from farm to the garden. And so we had a chance just to talk a little bit here before getting started, and it's going to be focusing mostly on garden scale no-till practices. So really excited for this. I'm Mike Bollinger. I'm the Executive Director at Seed Savers Exchange, and I'm going to be the host for this session. Just a quick special thanks to Rancho Gordo for also sponsoring this session. Rancho Gordo is a specialty producer and seller of heirloom beans based in Napa County, California, and they have generously supported today's events. Before we begin, I'd like to just put up here our community agreements. And as we go throughout the day and for this session as well, let's just be sure to be respectful and curious, patient. If you're going to be adding to the chat, let's be sure that you're speaking from your own experiences. Be conscious of intent versus impact. Make sure to take space and make space, and take care of self. So thank you for keeping these in mind as we go throughout the day. And I'd like to just do a quick introduction of Jonathan Conard. Is a farmer at 10th Street Orchard in Sterling, Kansas. He's had experience growing strawberries, apples, sweet corn, and a market garden. During the school year, he teaches biology at Sterling College, where his favorite classes include plant biology and environmental science. Today he's going to be talking with us about no-till practices and principles. He says traditional soil tillage increases soil erosion, degrades the soil microbial community, and decreases storage capacity for carbon and water. No-till practices developed for farming can be readily adapted to suit home and market gardens. And in this session, you'll learn practical ways to improve soil health and carbon storage, reduce tillage and weed pressure, and grow food more easily while combating climate change. So, Jonathan, thank you for being here with us today and for sharing your time with us.
Thanks for the introduction, Mike. I appreciate it. We're glad to be here with you and have the chance to talk a little bit about no-till and how that might be applied to a home garden setting. So as Mike mentioned, I'm Jonathan Conard. My full-time job is a professor of biology at Sterling College, but I have 2 months free during the summer when I get to do what I really enjoy, which is to farm and garden. And so we operate a pick-your-own orchard known as 10th Street Orchard here in Sterling, Kansas. We've grown strawberries for a number of years. We're starting an apple orchard now at this point, and we've grown sweet corn, blackberries, things along those lines. We also have a pretty good-sized home garden as well. So we like to grow tomatoes, peppers, radishes, greens, melons, just a variety of things in that. So when we think about climate change and how it relates to no-till, what we see is that we're all aware that climate change is a crisis that we're currently experiencing on a global scale. And so when we think about the causes of this, we see this being due primarily to an imbalance in the carbon cycle. And so when we look at carbon, it's going to be cycling between what we can think of as an atmospheric pool in the atmosphere and then a terrestrial pool, which is being stored in plants or animals or in the soil, as we'll focus on today. So when we look at, obviously the causes of climate change, we see this primarily being due to an imbalance there in this cycle. And so we're releasing much more carbon through burning, primarily burning fossil fuels, than we're able to absorb and store through the action of plants and living biological ecosystems. So when we think about, increases in CO2 levels and emissions, we know that these have been steadily rising across the globe from a number of different areas and countries, and the causes of these increases in CO2 levels are numerous. And so we're well aware of the impacts of climate change, including increasing global temperatures, greater precipitation variability, so longer periods of time when we have droughts, and then more intense periods of floods when the rain does fall. Obviously, melting sea ice in the Arctic, melting glaciers is a big issue. and then rising ocean levels occurring as a result of that, along with warmer ocean temperatures, leading to impacts such as coral bleaching, as you can see there. When we think about greenhouse gas emissions, we can recognize that these are caused directly by some of the individual choices that we make, as they're related to how we get from place to place, where we live, the type of goods that we consume, and then how we eat and how we grow our own food there as well. And even though I'd thought about climate change both personally and professionally for a number of years and really appreciated the magnitude and urgency of the situation, I didn't really start to make a connection between climate change impacts and how I was growing the food that me and my family eat until pretty recently. So it wasn't until 2018 when, on a bit of a whim, I attended a farmers conference in central Kansas known as the No-Till on the Plains Conference. And I primarily decided to attend the conference because, one, my cousin farms, he was going to be there, and then also the keynote speaker was Alan Savory, which is a pretty well-known name when it comes to holistic management and grazing systems. And so I really wanted to hear Savory speak in person. But as I left that conference, I came away with a whole new mindset on how to manage soil biology and how to improve soil health and how no-till might relate to this. So from that conference, I really learned that there are some significant benefits to no-till farming on any scale. And from the very first day that I started farming, well, you can see I love to drive tractor for one, but I also had the mindset from the very beginning that a clean field was how to farm. And so this is how my grandparents grew wheat and milo here on the high plains. I worked for my uncle driving tractor as we disc under wheat stubble during the summer to grow that. And the mindset that I had and that many farmers had prior to adopting these no-till practices was that the soil was essentially an inert substance for the crops to grow in, and you simply needed to add the right amounts of NPK in the form of chemical fertilizers in order to provide everything that the crops need. Now, unfortunately, in many places, this is still the way that farming is done. So this was a picture that was taken of a row crop farm here in Rice County, Kansas, just last week. And similarly, to my mindset about how farming should be done with clean fields and plowed earth, I took that same mindset into how I approached the garden. And so when I first started to garden, again, had the idea that a clean garden was a perfect garden. So when we first broke ground on our garden here at my house, we started to invert the soil. So shovel by shovelful, hoe by hoeful, we would churn up that soil and create bare ground to get ready for planting. A couple years later, I got my first rear tine tiller, and man, I thought that this was great. A few years after that, after just tilling in the spring before planting, tilling in the fall after harvest, I came to own a tractor and a 5-foot pull-behind PTO-driven tiller, and I thought that was fantastic. I couldn't get enough of it. And so when we were doing strawberries, I would till and till and till. We'd be tilling multiple times during the summer. I'd bring that over to the home garden, and man, I just thought that I had it made in terms of being able to prepare the soil and get this nice, finely churned bare ground as I was getting ready to plant my crops. What I found, though, was that no-till practices were kind of the antithesis of bare ground farming. And so in modern no-till agriculture, what we see is that instead of plowing or disking up the soil to prepare the ground for crops, the previous year's crop stubble is left, and then the new crop is just planted directly into that. So that residue acts essentially as a mulch, and then the new crop is just planted directly into that. As part of that conference, I learned that there are really a number of significant benefits to soil health by using this no-till type of approach on the farm. And so during that conference, I saw, a number of traditional row crop farmers who were there, and they were just listening eagerly, hanging on every word that these speakers said when they talked about soil health, and reviving this biology of the soil. And these guys were paying great attention, not so much because these practices help to sequester carbon and combat climate change, but most importantly, from a production standpoint for them, they help to improve that soil health, to bring back active biology in the soil and revive soils that have been pummeled from years of tillage. So what I started to learn that day was that there's a pretty well-known number of defined benefits of no-till farming. The first is a great reduction in the erosion of soil. So anytime that you have bare ground, whether that's due to tillage, overgrazing, or other factors, we see that that's going to cause the erosion of soil due to wind or water. So for example, the 1930s were a great example of a terrible time in which massive amounts of topsoil were lost simply due to the tremendous amounts of exposed bare ground that were occurring throughout the Great Plains due primarily to tillage as farmers increased their acreage and planted more and more wheat fields. So avoiding another environmental catastrophe like the Dust Bowl is a pretty high priority when we look at adopting practices to reduce soil erosion. The second factor is that no-till farming is going to be effective in conserving moisture. So in the part of the country where I live, we get about 30 inches of moisture in an average year. And it seems like it's been a couple years since we've actually had an average year, much less a good year. And so water is a precious commodity where I live. And so being able to conserve water is a very important thing. So no-till is going to improve the water holding capacity of the soil, reduce that runoff, and it kind of acts to drought-proof your garden or your field in many ways, which is especially important in a time of increasing global temperatures and precipitation variability. The third benefit of no-till is that it's going to improve the function of the soil and improve soil health. So when we think of soil, I grew up thinking about soil as dirt, right? And I kind of am ashamed to admit that now, but that was my mindset at the time. But I learned that soil is a complex living type of community. And so the USDA, in one of their informational pamphlets, actually described tillage as the equivalent of an earthquake, hurricane, tornado, and forest fire occurring simultaneously to the world of soil organisms. Wow, when I thought about that, you think about the disruption, disturbance that's caused by soil tillage and how that completely resets that biotic community, which is trying to develop within a healthy, functional soil system. The fourth benefit that we see is that it's going to build soil organic matter. So when we think about soil organic matter, this is great to improve for growing crops and vegetables and in our gardens, but it's also really important for sequestering carbon. And so soil is one of really the underappreciated ways that we're able to store a lot of carbon. And so these no-till practices are ones that enable us to store much more carbon within those soils and lose a lot less carbon due to tillage. So it was at this time, that I kind of knew about the benefits of no-till on kind of this farming scale. And so I started to really think a little bit more closely about how I was growing food, both in my garden and in our market farm there as well. So we were in strawberry production from 2016 to 2020. And it was after this conference that I really started to examine the impacts of what tillage was doing on my fields. So for strawberries, we would transplant plugs in the fall, and to prepare the field for that, we plant a cover crop, and then we would start to till, as early as July to turn it under once. We'd till again in August, and we'd till one last time in early September to really prepare to lay that plastic and to plant those strawberries there. So we're tilling up to 3 or 4 times throughout the course of a year on our strawberry fields. And what we saw was that I get about 12 inches of just perfectly churned up and pummeled soil. But what I started to find out was that underneath that 12 inches was this tremendous hard pan layer. And so just that compaction that repeated mechanical tillage was causing was greatly harming the soils on my farm itself. And this was the first time that I really started to have doubts about tilling on my farm and market setting. So the question that I started thinking was, I know some of these benefits of no-till farming, and I know some of the impacts that tillage is having, but how do I translate no-till from a farm scale to a garden scale? So no-till on a farm scale can perhaps better be described as chemical till. In fact, that's how my uncle talked about no-till farming, because you have to rely on chemicals, mostly glyphosate, to burn down and kill the weeds before planting. And so I thought, I don't want to do anything like that in my own garden. That's just not going to work. So how can I adopt some of these no-till practices without that chemical approach that's used by many row crop farmers who are doing no-till at this point? So after several years then of really doing some serious thought and reading and experimentation, what I found was that there are some ways to translate and to get these benefits of no-till on a garden scale. And so we've kind of borrowed and modified and adopted and found out some of these no-till principles that we use now for growing food in our home garden. And this is what I want to share with you during the rest of my talk. So when we look at how to do no-till on a garden scale, there's just a few basic things that we need to do. And there's a variety of different ways that this can be done. And I'll talk about some of the ways they've been done in my garden, but certainly every place is different. And we want to, there's room for adaptation based on those conditions. So when we look at these no-till gardening principles, we see there's 4 things. 1, don't invert the soil, keep the soil covered, keep living roots in the soil, and feed that soil biology at all times. So we'll talk about each one of those here in turn. So the number 1 thing, no-till gardening principle, is don't invert the soil. So whether that's by shovel or by a rear tine tiller, front tine tiller, a PTO-driven rotary tiller, don't invert the soil. Principles number 2, don't invert the soil. Number 3, don't invert the soil as well. So if there's one thing I can impress upon you, you try to keep from this massive inversion of the soil, which destroys that fungal community, resets that successional clock, and essentially drives your soil biology back to a bacterial-dominated type of community. So try to not invert the soil. So when we look at this, then how do we do this without shoveling or tilling? So over time, that soil in our garden has tended to loosen up, to the point where we can just use a small trowel for transplanting, a cobra-headed rake to seed for direct seeding, and we really don't have to turn up or turn over that soil at all as we get ready to plant. If we want to kill some weeds, we'll just put down a layer of cardboard there and then be able to plant underneath that within a few weeks' time. The second principle is we need to keep that soil covered. And so this is one of the original reasons that I started to adopt no-till in the garden. So for a couple of years, when I was trying to start to think about this, I'd have one half of the garden that I'd till with the rotary tiller and one half that I would just adopt a no-till practices. And what I found was that the side that I was tilling looked great for the first couple of weeks. So for 3-4 weeks, it would look tremendous. There'd be nice bare ground. I get things planted and going. But after that, I found that I had turned up all of these weed seeds and brought those to the surface and created a perfect environment for the weed seeds to germinate. And so finally, ultimately I gave up tilling, not just because of the benefits for the soil, but because I got tired of weeding. So you can see in that first picture there, there's some strawberries underneath there, but the weeds are doing much, much better because tillage just creates perfect conditions for them. Now, when I want to weed the garden, it's a pretty simple task. So everything's covered with a layer of cardboard with straw mulch or other organic material on top. And so it's just a few weeds here or there. After a couple of years, that weed seed bed has died down, and I don't have nearly as many problems after I've kept that soil covered. So cardboard and straw mulch is primarily the way that we do it, but you can also keep the soil covered by a living crop canopy. You can see some of our no-till transplanting there. We just plant directly into that cardboard, put the straw around it. By the end of the season, almost all of that's decomposed and broken down there. The living canopy comes from keeping those plants spaced closely together. In terms of your crop spacing, you can also run, vining plants, cucumbers, melons there in between the plants that are taller and need to be spaced out a little bit more there. You can see kind of okra planted with a melon vine running in between there as an example of keeping that soil covered. And the third principle is to try to keep living roots in the soil. So when we have living roots, they're going to be interacting with those soil microorganisms. They're going to be providing carbon and root exudates to kind of feed that soil there as well. And then the soil fungal community is going to be providing these nutrients that the plants can take up and just really enhancing that growth and nutrient cycling that's taking place. So some ways that you can keep these living roots in the soil are you plant a cover crop. So a cover crop is just something that you grow in between the crops that you're harvesting. In some places that might look like a cover crop of winter rye. And so this can be planted in the fall. You grow it through until you're ready to plant in the spring, then just cover it up with your cardboard or a large tarp until it dies down. And then you have this nice layer that's starting to decompose that you can plant into. You can also plant perennials, right? So when you think about perennial flowers, for example, there's nothing that says a garden can't be beautiful as well as functional. These are also great for attracting some pollinators. We've got some grapevines and some lavender planted amidst our vegetable garden at home, which serves that purpose of keeping those roots in the soil. And thirdly, once you're done with some of your early crops, once you pull out those potatoes and onions, you'll go right back in and plant a fall crop or some type of cover crop at that point. And so we've had some real success doing cowpeas. And so they can get started late, they can grow through the summer heat, and they provide, a nice side crop. But the main purpose is to keep that soil covered, keep those roots going in there as well. But the next principle is to feed that soil biology. So again, we think of that soil not just as an inert substance, but as this living, complex community with all of these different types of microorganisms organisms. So we've got earthworms, and we've got these nematodes and bacteria and fungi, and all of those need to be balanced as part of the soil food web. And so Elaine Ingham has done a great job of kind of explaining some of these principles of the biology of soil. But when we think about this, we kind of just need to remember, hey, if we feed the soil, we're going to be feeding the plant. And so some of the ways that we can do this are providing, some sources of nitrogen for the soil. So adding some compost or manures to the soil. Some of the ways that we do this at home are we use aged compost from our chickens or from our sheep bedding that we've got. My kids started a leaf raking business in the fall. They really like it because they have a nice job and then they get paid a little bit. And I said, hey, I'll take my payment in terms of the leaves. And so we bring all those back, compost those, and then add those to the garden the following year as this nice compost layer that we see. But use what's available, right? Any type of organic matter, once it's been composted, can do pretty well for you. We do try to avoid using grass or hay just for the potential of bringing in weed seeds, but pretty much anything else can do well for you. When we think about seed saving, this is also a way to keep roots in the soil. And so we're not just growing a crop to harvest it and then be done. We're keeping those seeds for next year. So by growing these open pollinated types of varieties, you can see, what do you guess those are? Well, you see some basil there, next to some romaine lettuce that's gone to seed. And so I'm going to keep those there. We'll save the seeds. And then at the end of the year, I'll just clip off the tops and leave the roots there in the soil where they can decompose naturally and help to store that much more carbon within my soil. So when we think about, gardening and growing, what we see is that the benefits of, when we think about, the average fruit or vegetable travels over 1,000 miles from the farm to the table. We can certainly see, great carbon benefits in terms of growing our own food locally, or supporting local farmers, going to the farmers market or pick your own farms. But when we think about this, eating locally makes a big difference in terms of carbon and climate change, but also the way that we grow our own food makes a big difference as well. We found a lot of benefits from stopping tillage in our garden, from reducing weed pressure. We've seen our soil become progressively looser and fertile the longer that we went without tilling, and just growing that soil health, making it easier for us, and also helping in terms of sequestering and storing carbon and combating climate change, has been a thing that's made us pretty happy in terms of how we're able to grow our food. And so hopefully the experience that we've had has maybe helped you think just a little bit more about some of these possible benefits of no-till, and think about maybe some of these ways that they could be translated into your own gardens and provide a way to reduce labor, increase production, and make a positive difference when we think about climate change. So with that, I'd be glad to take any questions that you might have. And then I also wanted to share some of the resources that were useful to me in my thought process of transitioning to no-till, and maybe those will be of use to you there as well as you think about some ways that this can be applied.
Jonathan, thank you so much. You packed a lot into a short time there. So thank you for taking the time to put those slides together and share the information that you have. I can see your science background coming through in the things that you're talking about. So no, it's really, really great. Couple of things here we did have. Well, one of the first things, I guess I should go back and see if I can try to find it. Somebody was asking if they had heard you correctly as to whether or not you were saying 30 inches of rain.
30 inches, yes.
Yeah,
that's what we get. So that may seem like a lot in some places, a little in others, but that's kind of where we're at.
Right. And so when you're talking about maintaining soil moisture through those no-till practices, that's definitely one of the considerations, right?
Yes, yeah, very important for us for sure.
Another question that came up was thinking about loosening up the soil, right? Compaction that can kind of come along with no-till. And so I had a couple of different people ask about loosening with a fork. So I think in this, they're talking about those broad fork tools to be able to kind of come in. And so you're not inverting the soil like you're talking about, but you're still kind of opening up and letting some of that oxygen in. Do you use anything like that, or do you want to talk about any of the tools that have helped you?
We've done just a little bit of that, and it's something that we haven't done regularly. Our soil's kind of a sandy loam, and so it's a little bit looser to begin with. So depending maybe on the soil type, I could certainly see broad fork having some advantages. And the nice thing about that is it's not completely churning up or turning over the soil. So I think maybe you get some of the advantages of loosening that soil, but at the same time, you're not completely destroying the biology there as well. So I would say that would fit with what we're doing. We don't use it just because our soil has gotten loose enough where we don't see that being a need.
Yeah, no, that's great. So yeah, along those lines, that makes me think about, when you kind of make the decision to go from, really turning the soil to, okay, I'm gonna flip the switch and switch to no-till practices. Were there any steps or things that you had to do that you'd like to share with the folks here about what helped you be successful? I'm just thinking about, building up that soil organic matter, or any initial steps that you took.
Sure, I would probably the most important thing that we did was to have patience. And so if you're going from till to no-till, there's probably going to be a pretty good weed seed bed that's in there initially. And then also when you add that, if you do cardboard and straw, that's a pretty carbon heavy mulch. And so sometimes that ties up some of the nitrogen in your soil. And so it kind of takes a while maybe for that soil biology to get going. And to start breaking that down and to get balanced back out. So for us, maybe it took a season or so before we really started to see that click. But I would say, the benefits of weed suppression are pretty immediate, and I like that. And then the soil biology kind of works itself out within a year or so, in my experience, at least.
Yeah. And what about with any of the, are you leaving a lot of that you're leaving that residual crop residue there? Have you seen any disease issues or disease pressure coming up with this over time?
That's something that I wondered about, and I haven't seen anything greater when we switched to no-till than we did when we did till. I do take, some of the disease-prone crops we've got are the heirloom tomatoes, and so when I finish up with those, I will uproot those and get those out of the garden, but everything else will leave, and it doesn't seem to have really changed our disease pressure, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
And I don't, maybe you could do it with tomatoes as well. I just haven't been quite brave enough to leave them in and see what happens.
Right. Another thing that came up was Bob said, "I've had good luck using crimson clover to keep my garden covered. Seems to keep the weeds down." This comment makes me think about like living walkways, right? Or those areas where you could keep roots in the ground, right? Keep that matter there. Keep the microbiology within those soils and around those garden areas active. Do you do anything like that, or can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea, and we haven't done that much in the home garden because we've got everything packed in there as tight as we can. Essentially, when we're doing strawberries, we would plant an annual rye in between the rows so that we'd have living roots there. So I think it's a great idea. It would be a perfect fit for no-till practices. It's just something that we haven't had the opportunity to really do too much. But yeah, I think that's a great concept for sure.
Yeah. Another, your presentation makes me think about another farmer that I know that's down in the Missouri area, who, when they finish and they're a market gardener, but when they finish harvesting a crop, say of salad greens or something like that, they literally they pull a big tarp or a big physical barrier over the top of those plants that they had just harvested through, giving it a couple of weeks to help kind of expedite the breakdown of that material, and then they come back and then they'll just plant right through that broken down residual material as well. So if you think about the number of steps, right? You're talking about, okay, I came in and I rototilled the first time, and then I tried to come back and stale bed the second time, and all of those kind of preparatory steps that you take to be able to get a garden area, quote, clean, right? It's a lot of steps. It's a lot of time and energy too. And oftentimes, some of these no-till practices are a way to really simplify and maybe even minimize some of the time that you have to spend in the garden doing the things that the weeding.
Yeah, I would say so. We I've definitely seen some labor savings there as well. And it's still work, but it's different.
Right.
And
You can just walk around and enjoy, enjoy yourself with a nice iced tea or something like that, right?
That's right.
Rather than having to be down on a knee pad or something.
Right.
For as long.
Since weeding is probably my least favorite thing to do in the garden, this has been a pretty good fit.
No, that's great. Oh, well, Jonathan, thank you so much for your time today. I know I learned some things. I'm sure our audience did as well. And, these recordings are available and get watched throughout, throughout time. So thank you so much. And just quickly in closing, we're going to take a quick lunch break. We'll be back at 1 o'clock with Jay Tracy to talk on the topic of confronting climate concerns with indigenous heritage cucurbit varieties. So we'll be back at 1 o'clock. We look forward to seeing you all then. And Jonathan, enjoy the rest of your day, and maybe you'll get to join us for following presentations as well.
That sounds good. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thanks a lot. Bye.